I'm going to start firstly by saying kia ora koutou. It's really good to be home. I've spent a lot of time travelling the last couple of weeks and I don't know if I would have agreed to a session this week again if it had not been here. It's really nice to be back in Aotearoa. So just as a sense, how many are actual Aucklanders here? Most people. So there's a little bit of travel, right? But not a lot. So I can call you Jaffers because I am one, so I can get away with that. And for my colleagues from Australia and around the place, they have no idea what we just said. So my gift to you is you can explain that to them at the break. I kind of have this, I'll explain to Scott's point where this sort of term came from. A good friend of mine is a pretty well-known analyst in the US in the CRM category. And we were spending some time talking about some of the different events and things that he was doing and I was doing, and he came up with this term and it's kind of stuck. But to kind of just break that down in really simple terms, when we're looking at growth today, you know, the role of traditional digital analysts as we have thought about them doesn't quite get us all the way there now. When we think about tech and how that's emerged and you know what it's giving us in terms of new capabilities, that was what we focused on. But really now, what we're seeing is that actually growth is coming out of societal change. It's coming out of cultural change. Tech is influencing that, and then we are, as humans, behaving or responding to new tech in ways that weren't predictable, which is now influencing back in the tech. So we're kind of in this infinite loop where digital and where society and culture emerge together. And so if you don't have much of a regard for society, for culture, for trying to measure that and understand that through the social sciences, you struggle now to really get coherent growth strategy when you think about it holistically. So in my role, I get a chance to spend some time with execs and strategy teams and marketing groups and whatnot, and I typically always get asked this question. It's become pretty predictable. And it may be sort of in a whispered sort of hushed tone in a break because people feel like they should know what this is, or it might be hedged in kind of, so what's your take on the experience economy? And so we started talking about this and trying to unpack it a little bit. But it came up all the time, and we sort of joke about it in the office as like this, one of these populist cultural questions, right? So, is Elvis really alive, maybe? What's really going on in Area 51? Oh, we've jumped too far. Who killed Tupac? You know, this kind of stuff. What exactly is the experience economy? And I think to try and get a sense of what that is, we really need to think about it in context of consumption behaviour, because that's the thing that's moving markets. And it's moving markets in ways that we hadn't really seen before. So when we talk about the experience economy, we're talking about experience that drives behaviour that we monetize. But we're doing that at volume and at scale. And Scott spoke brilliantly about a whole lot of things that we're seeing from a trend perspective there. I almost felt like I probably don't need to get up, because these are the sorts of trends that we've seen. But to understand it, it's worth jumping into a little bit of economics. This was a study that Lee S. Kaplan did in the US. She runs a very small consultancy, but it's a piece of work that gets referenced a lot. And what she found looking at in the CPI index between 1960 and 2010 is that the price of commodities just track along pretty much at the rate of inflation, which isn't really news to anyone. And it's only in our recent history that the price of goods sort of broke away from that. Now again, if you think about that from a consumption behaviour perspective, this is really the time when we started to see the rise of convenience, right? We became hyper busy, super connected, and therefore perversely more time poor. And so we rated the ability to get hold of goods or products that moved up the needle faster. We were into convenience brands. If you look at the market cap of a company like 7-Eleven during this period, that tells you a story, right? From a consumption behaviour perspective, we were really interested in convenience. Now, if you go back a little bit before that, we had this thing that people often refer to as a services revolution. This kind of happened late 80s, early 90s. And I dispute that it's a services revolution, because what we were seeing a lot then, and it still happens today with a lot of brands, is that in order to differentiate their products or their offerings in market, they were doing so through the experience that they could provide in the services that were wrapped around those offerings. I actually think this is the true start of what we're seeing now from an experience economy perspective. Now, the brands that really figured that notion out, they also figured out that if you could inject that same principle into every touch point of your customer, not just in the services piece, then they're sort of what I and others refer to as experience brands. And if you look in the CPI, they broke away. Now, these trends kind of materialised and became mega trend, if you like, or recognised globally around about the mid-90s. And it was 1998 that Gilmore and Pine first coined this term, the experience economy, in the Harvard Business Journal. Now that book is 21 years old this year. So why am I getting asked in 2019, what's the experience economy? If you haven't got the book, I recommend you get it. In fact, in December this year, they're relaunching a new edition of that, so maybe I'll hold off and grab that one. But it was really interesting because when you look at some of the things they talk about, it's almost prophetic, and the wave that we saw from a consumption behaviour really materialised in the around 2010, and particularly the latter half of this decade, which we'll get into a bit. Now, these guys hit us in 2015, and this is what caused a lot of change in the last half. Why did that happen? If you think about the CPI study we've just saw, that ended 2010. That's nearly a decade ago, right? In a couple of months, we closed this decade out. So what happened since? I think everyone knows, 2012, we hit 2 billion internet users. That's roughly double the number of internet users we had in 2007. So we had this epic growth in internet consumption. And I want to come back to that range later in the talk. So remember that date range, 2007 to 2012. Now in 2012, we also saw cloud computing become mainstream. Now that cloud and some of the promises that cloud is now delivering, particularly around mass scale computing, the delivery of things like AI, and we'll hear from Geraldine later in the day about that. That's really going to set the tone for the next decade. Identity and AI in the next decade will shape the world. So that was 2012. By 2015, we were consuming the internet more on our mobile devices than we were on our PCs. So we had two epic megatrends, the rise of the internet and the rise of mobile, and that paved the ways for these guys. Now, what most people don't understand is that a platform like Google and the social media companies have absolutely retrained global macro societal consumption behaviour at scale and at pace. If you want to date tonight, I'm not looking at anyone in particular as I say that, if you want to date tonight, just swipe. That psychology pervades every experience and expectation that you have of a brand. If you're at home tonight buying a bicycle for your 6-year-old daughter, you have an expectation of that brand experience. If you are a procurement officer in a bottling company buying cardboard boxes to ship your goods, you have the same expectation. It's macro, it's societal, there's no escape from that. Now, if you read about this stuff and you start getting into the social sciences area, if you're having trouble sleeping, you'll read a lot about this. Now, we've always had bias, but we're seeing some unique attributes in human bias right now. Bias only really started being studied in the 1970s. There's 170 different human biases, but there are 3 that dominate our behaviour today. And we've heard of them most of the time, right? Confirmation bias, I think everyone knows, is just the propensity to see any information as evidence of an opinion that you already had. Right, I saw a tweet once that said, I had 20 inches of global warming land in my backyard last night. Right? It snowed and therefore it disproved climate change. Dunning-Kruger effect. This is basically a superiority complex on steroids, and it operates in 2 parts. The first is that you decide that you know more than someone else irrespective of who they are or where they come from. So in other words, you could be the CEO, a major brand owner, a pioneer in your industry, a global thought leader, recognised everywhere, but your prospective customer on Sunday morning read an article about your industry for 1 minute and 22 seconds, and as far as they're concerned, they know more than you. And here's the kicker. You might have written the article. And the second part of Dunning-Kruger is this propensity to rule out any information that challenges your worldview. So we're kind of like a 3-year-old sitting in a corner with our fingers in our ears and our eyes clenched tight, stomping our feet and screaming to try and drown out the corrective behaviour that an adult's trying to give us. right? We have a worldview and we stick to it tighter than we ever have before. And the last is cognitive dissonance, the spaghetti junction of the human condition, where we're not exactly linear. So our biases contradict our preferences, the things that we think we like and the things that we think we do, and the reasons that we do things or the reasons that we think we do things, our biases contradict that all the time. And the biases contradict our biases as well. So this kind of wraps up where our behavior contradicts our cognition. So a really bad example is I smoke, behavior, even though I know it will kill me, cognition. Now, when you combine these biases, one of the things that we've seen is the rapid movement of belief systems and worldviews, right? We basically decide what we believe in now based on how we feel. We don't care about data. Check this out. This is the view from the scientific community versus mass population. So the entire weight of evidence tells us that genetically modified organisms, not organisations, don't eat an organisation, they are safe to eat. Less than 40% of us agree as if we have a basis to disagree. We see that in animal research, human evolution, and so forth. Sitting around a table, you've probably been asked this question, right? Or you've been in a debate, do you believe in climate change? I'm not going to get into that particular back and forth, but whether you believe in climate change or whether you are a climate change skeptic, you're both wrong. It's not a belief system. Isn't it interesting that we ask each other whether we believe in something that is a field of scientific study? We haven't done that before, right? Now, belief systems are interesting. There's lots of studies in them. We're not going to go into them today, but I wanted to share my favourite one. I've just been in the US, so I didn't share this one here. It's a particularly challenging military operation to plan, I'm told. Right, so great brands figure out how to ride the ecosystem. And believe me, it's an ecosystem. One of the things that social media companies have taught us is that it's all about me and it's all about now. And when we talk about the experience economy, both of those words are very deliberate terms, right? We can spend a lot of time around human experience and experience design and these sorts of concepts. Economy is just a deliberate word, just as a deliberate word. The companies that are riding this wave are transferring massive amounts of economic value across our financial system. This isn't just a buzz term. Between 2010 and 2013, there were 11 unicorns announced to the world. A unicorn is a company that's been valued at $1 billion for the first time, right? It's a pretty epic day in those founders' lives. 11 of them in the first 4 years of this decade. I want you to place a bet, either in your head or you can tell your colleague next door. In fact, do that. That'll be interesting to see how we go. How many unicorns have there been since? So 11 in the first 4 years of this decade. We're about to close the decade out. In the next 5.5 years, how many unicorns have there been? Everyone got a number in their head? I want to tell you something about these companies. First of all, they're born into this time. So they are, without exception, digitally native and customer obsessed. They don't know any other way. There's not a traditional operating system to get out of. There's not traditional stage thinking to break away from. They live and breathe in this space. They are worth today a collective 1.3 trillion US dollars. I can't even comprehend that number either. Like it's just, I could have said anything, right? But 1.3 trillion US dollars. Now that money, that value didn't just evaporate and come out of the sky. It didn't fall down like manna from heaven. It came from point A to point B. It transferred across our financial ecosystem and our systems. It came from incumbents. Maybe it came from your organisation. Between 2000 and 2015, we saw 52% of the Fortune 500 companies gone. 52%. The study before that we saw between 1960 and 2010 is interesting in itself. The S&P 500 When companies were entering that 500, that index, they were on average in 1960 about 60 years old. So 1960, 60 years old, easy to remember. Today, the average age of a company entering the S&P 500 is less than 12. That is a 500% market compression rate. If you do not understand the experience economy is an economic tidal wave that you either ride or get crushed by, you need to. So we live in a time of digital Darwinism. I think a lot of people have heard this expression, right? It's effectively defined as a time when tech and society is evolving faster than businesses can naturally adapt to. And if you're an incumbent organisation that's traded in a certain way for a long period of time, it's very hard to make adaptations to what we think the market is moving towards. It's very hard if you're a board member to know what kinds of business cases to approve or not approve because it's moving so quickly. And if you're a brand owner, how do you think about that critically and make the right asks? It's going super quick. Let's bring you back to that date range, 2007 to 2012. When the internet was exploding on us, what else happened in that time frame economically? Think about that date range. 2007 to 2012, what happened then? Thank you. Everyone remembers this image, right? Global financial crisis. There's a lot written about that. And usually it focuses on the subprime mortgage crisis out of the US and the virus that impacted the economies around the world and so on and so forth. But the fundamental underlying issue that we encountered was just human greed. Yeah, it got in the way again. And we were making so much money that our traditional instruments of systems of control and governance were kind of sidelined. These financial organisations were having company valuations based on these exotic instruments that had very little to do with the traditional metrics of performance. And so when you look at a healthy company, that kind of looks like this. For those that understand some risk management concepts here, they'll understand where their point of tolerance is. In other words, at what point, when we suffer a loss, can the company sustain that loss? If we go beyond that point, it's Armageddon financially, right? We're in receivership or liquidation administration. We've got directors in trouble with the law, or life as we know it has ceased. And where they'll typically then is trade their business within bounds of risk appetite, because we're commercial organisations, so we've got to take risk. You don't want to not take enough risk, but you also want to make sure that you have an upper bound of where you calibrate the business and risk taking. And really healthy businesses will typically have a gap between their upper bound and their risk tolerance. And what we saw in the GFC was this. We kind of inverted that, because no matter what we did, we just made more and more money. And when the bubble burst, we had this massive human catastrophe. We had Armageddon. When I'm dealing with these sorts of senior audiences sometimes and they're trying to calibrate and think about how they approach this, we often talk about risk and reward. We talk about aggressive, go after the market, change your business model innovation, that kind of thing, versus the sort of post-period of the GFC. And we kind of play it out like this. We've got this period of time of digital Darwinism. The explosion of the internet, the explosion of mobile, the explosion of social, the change of consumption behaviour. And at that period, at the same time, we had the GFC. And what we're living in right now is the post-GFC pendulum effect. I think everyone knows what pendulum effect is, right? And if you look at macro history, usually something affects society and it bounces out to one end. But we don't just settle back in the middle with some common sense. We tend to go right out the other end and then work our way back a few times and come back to the middle. That's why there's a whole lot of really interesting commentators right now that are talking about pendulum effect in context of the US political system, where we went from Obama to Trump in one electoral cycle. Like super, super fast. So we live in this kind of time post the GFC. We were in this pendulum effect, which in other words means we've got a lot of hyper-conservatism in the boardroom right now. The world is changing around us faster than it's ever changed. And we're also concerned about placing bets because we're scarred. Like 2012 was 7 years ago. In today's world, that's not long ago at all. And the experienced directors on boards have been living through that. So when we think about how do we resolve that, Scott touched on it before, it's actually the way we think about change. How do we marry those two worlds? So we live in this time of, and it's really been codified since the start of the Industrial Revolution, just two-phase change or two-phase decision making, right? And a very simple principle, we use information to make decisions. The better the information, the better the decision. The more timely the information, the better the decision, right? So we have this operational data that Scott alluded to before, which is, we know what our average sale price is, and we know how long it takes to get there, and we know what our unit cost is, and we've got data coming out of the supply chain. We know what our financial metrics are and where they need to point. Taxi, right? So we've got all that kind of data, and it tells us things like, for example, we have revenue decline in a market segment where the data is also telling us that that market segment is actually in double-digit growth on the whole. So why is that happening? And when we see that data, we rush to the disruption zone. We want to stop the bleeding, we want to create new value. Now in the digital era, what that has typically meant is we just try and modernize our transaction layer. We haven't changed our business model at all. We've just gone from horse and cart to car. We've gone from mass sales reps to online commerce. But our model hasn't changed particularly. So this has kind of been codified in the way that we've thought about running businesses for a long time. And we're challenged now because we are less linear as human beings than we have ever been because of our consumption behavior. It's the humans that are driving mass market shifts. So what I wanted to leave with you today is this challenge. What are the companies that are actually riding that ecosystem wave? What's the fundamental thing that they are doing? And what they are doing is they're transitioning out of the traditional two-phase change into three-phase change. The principle is still the same. You need information to make decisions. But what we're trying to do now is go from what is happening, which is still critical data, to why it's happening as well. It doesn't matter if you know that you're having massive revenue decline if you don't know why that's happening. If the root cause issue is fundamentally that the way that your market is thinking about your brand now has changed, then you can't resolve it. And this is where just through evidence, this is where a lot of brands fall down. Remember our belief systems? It's about how we feel dictates what we believe. So we see a lot of brands going, but we're the best, or we're the cheapest, or we've got the most experience. Customers don't care if you don't make them feel good about it, because they will choose to believe in the other guy even if the data doesn't back it up. So three-phase change is critical, or you can't go anywhere. You're going to be guessing. You don't have the heartbeat of the sentiment driving the market that's killing their revenue in that segment. Yeah? So at the start of this, I put up that question that we get asked all the time, what's your take on the experience economy? And I wanted to close with this. I try and boil this down really simply. It's just the prevailing drivers of economic value today. We get some pretty senior people that often say, it's all very nice, guys, but we don't really need to be too concerned with the feelings of our customer. I'm not their uncle, right? We still get that. But what they can't do is put their head in the sand when it is the prevailing driver of economic value. This is just a straight, hardcore business decision. Are you going to be informed to be effective in the economic environment we are in today, or are you not? I usually, at the end of these sessions when I'm traveling, get to sort of talk a little bit about being a Kiwi and then what we do at the end of sessions and then close. I don't have to do that today, so let me just close by saying tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Scott.